Ethan Carter sat in his dimly lit cabin, the storm outside raging with a ferocity that rattled the very bones of his isolated home. The wind howled through the thick pine trees, slamming against the wooden walls with such force that it felt as though the house itself might take flight. Snow fell in thick sheets, an unrelenting blizzard that swallowed the world beyond his window into an abyss of white nothingness. It was the kind of storm that turned the wilderness into a death trap, where even the most experienced woodsman could vanish without a trace, buried beneath the merciless frost. Inside, the only light came from the fireplace, its flames casting flickering shadows across the room. The heat barely managed to keep the biting cold at bay, the air still thick with the scent of burning wood and the faint dampness of snowmelt seeping through the cracks. Ethan had spent years alone in this cabin, away from the chaos of society, away from the ghosts that haunted his past. The storm should have been nothing more than another night, another battle between nature and his endurance. But tonight, something felt different. A sound. A noise so faint he might have imagined it. A knock. Ethan's body tensed instantly. He turned his head toward the door, heart hammering in his chest. No one came this far out. No one should be knocking. It was impossible. The nearest town was miles away, and anyone foolish enough to be caught in this storm wouldn't have made it this far. Then it came again, barely audible over the wind. A slow, deliberate knock. His breath hitched. He reached for the rifle leaning against the chair, his fingers tightening around the cold steel of the barrel. His instinct screamed at him, danger. This had to be a trick of the wind, or worse, someone who wasn't supposed to be here. Taking slow, measured steps toward the door, he placed his ear against the rough wood, listening. Silence. Only the storm, the wind, the trees creaking under the weight of ice. And then, a whimper. Not human. Ethan hesitated for a moment before unlocking the heavy bolts and yanking the door open. A blast of freezing wind tore through the cabin, stinging his face and biting into his skin. Snow swirled inside, a flurry of white chaos illuminated by the firelight. And there, half buried in the snow, was a dog. A massive, half-wolf of a creature, its thick fur matted with ice, its body trembling violently from the cold. Its sides rose and fell in quick, shallow breaths, each exhale sending a faint mist into the frozen air. But what caught Ethan's attention most wasn't the size of the beast, nor the desperate look in its amber eyes. It was the wound. A deep gash, torn across its side, darkened its fur with frozen blood. It was fresh but had started to clot in the frigid air, leaving a jagged line of exposed flesh beneath the thick coat. The injury was too clean to be the work of another animal, too precise. A knife? A trap? Someone had done this. Ethan exhaled slowly, the sight of the suffering animal sending a sharp, unexpected pang through his chest. He had seen wounds like this before. He had caused wounds like this before. The dog made a small, pitiful noise, barely more than a whisper against the howling storm. It tried to move, to stand, but its legs gave out beneath it, its body collapsing onto the snow with a sickening finality. Ethan knew what this meant. The animal was close to its limit. If he left it out here, it wouldn't see the morning. A part of him hesitated. He hadn't had company in years, hadn't wanted it. He had built this life to avoid connections, to keep the world outside where it belonged. But something in the dog's gaze, the quiet desperation, the pain, the sheer will to survive despite everything, made the decision for him. With a grunt, Ethan bent down and slid his arms under the animal's massive frame. It was heavier than he expected, its muscles still taut beneath the thick fur despite its weakened state. The moment he lifted it, the dog whimpered again, a sharp, pained sound that made his grip tighten instinctively. Easy, he muttered, though he doubted the animal understood him. Just hold on. He stepped back inside, kicking the door shut behind him, sealing them both away from the merciless storm. The warmth of the fire hit immediately, melting the snow that clung to his coat, sending icy droplets sliding down his neck. He carried the dog to the fireplace, laying it carefully onto an old, thick blanket near the heat. The dog let out a low, shuddering breath, its muscles twitching as warmth began to seep into its frozen limbs. Its amber eyes flickered open, watching him cautiously, the exhaustion behind them so deep Ethan felt it in his own bones. He moved quickly, pulling supplies from an old metal box tucked away in the corner of the room. The first aid kit was stocked mostly for himself. Old habits died hard, but it would have to do. Uncorking a bottle of antiseptic, he poured it over the wound in one swift motion. The dog snarled, its body tensed violently, teeth bared in a reflexive warning, but it was too weak to fight. Ethan worked fast, pressing a clean cloth against the wound, staunching the bleeding. The fur around the injury was thick, tangled with dried blood, making it difficult to assess the full extent of the damage. He could feel the heat radiating off the animal's skin. Fever was already setting in. Damn it. He reached for a needle and thread, hands steady despite the situation. He had done this before. Too many times. Stitching skin back together, patching wounds that should have been fatal. He worked in silence, ignoring the low, trembling growls of the dog as he closed the gash, pulling the flesh together in tight, precise stitches. By the time he finished, sweat had formed on his brow despite the cold. The dog was still watching him, its breathing steadier now, though pain still lingered in its gaze. It was trusting him, if only because it had no other choice. Ethan sat back, exhaling slowly, his muscles aching from tension. The storm outside showed no signs of relenting, the wind still howling, rattling the windows as if trying to claw its way inside. But for now, in this small cabin, in this quiet, firelit space, the battle was momentarily won. He glanced at the dog again. "Guess we're stuck with each other now," he muttered. The dog's ears twitched slightly, but it said nothing. Ethan sighed and leaned back, staring into the fire. He had lived alone for years, convinced he wanted nothing but solitude. And yet, as the storm raged outside, for the first time in a long time, he wasn't alone. The dog's body was a trembling mass of frozen fur and pain, but Ethan ignored his own discomfort as he lowered it onto the thick blanket near the fire. The heat was weak at first, barely cutting through the icy weight clinging to its body, but after a few moments, the snow on its fur began to melt, soaking into the fabric beneath it. A slow, shuddering breath escaped the animal's muzzle, and Ethan took that as a good sign. It was still alive, for now. The cabin was eerily silent except for the howling wind rattling the windows and the occasional crack of burning wood in the fireplace. Ethan worked quickly, his hands moving with practiced efficiency as he reached for his supplies. The dog twitched when he touched its fur, its muscles tightening beneath his fingertips. A low growl rumbled from its throat, not a threat, but a warning, a desperate instinct to defend itself even in its weakened state. "Easy," Ethan muttered, his voice rough from years of disuse. "Not gonna hurt you." The words felt strange on his tongue, foreign, like they didn't belong to him. He wasn't used to speaking aloud anymore. There had been no one to talk to for a long time. The dog flinched again when he pressed a cloth soaked in warm water against its wound, its body jerking as a sharp whimper escaped its throat. Ethan's grip tightened, his fingers digging into the thick fur to keep it still. The gash was deep, jagged, torn open by something cruel. It wasn't just the storm that had done this. Ethan exhaled sharply, anger flaring in his chest. A trap? A blade? Whatever had sliced into this animal had been deliberate. Someone had wanted it to suffer. And now, here it was, lying half dead on his floor, shivering and beaten down, barely clinging to life. He grabbed the antiseptic bottle and poured it over the wound in one swift motion. The reaction was immediate. The dog jerked violently, a strangled yelp ripping from its throat as its limbs thrashed weakly against the blanket. Its teeth bared, snapping at the empty air, but it was too exhausted to fight back properly. It was humiliated, vulnerable, completely at his mercy. Ethan pressed down harder, forcing the cloth against the wound, ignoring the way the dog whimpered under his hands. "I know it hurts," he muttered, his voice steady. "But you'll live." The dog didn't respond, but its breathing evened out slightly, its body slowly giving in to the warmth of the fire. The shivering was still there, but less violent now, its muscles loosening bit by bit. Ethan wiped away the excess blood, revealing the extent of the damage. The cut ran deep, dangerously close to muscle, but it wasn't fatal, not if he acted fast. His fingers moved quickly, threading the needle with ease. He had done this before. Too many times. The old instincts came back with frightening clarity: how to hold the skin just right, how to pull the thread tight enough to seal the wound but not tear through the flesh. He didn't even flinch when the first stitch went in, but the dog did. Its whole body tensed, legs twitching as it let out a broken, ragged sound. A sound of pain. A sound of defeat. Ethan felt something in his chest tighten at that. "Almost done," he said, though he doubted the animal understood him. It didn't matter. He wasn't really talking to the dog anyway. He was talking to himself. The minutes stretched long and slow. The storm raged outside, the wind howling against the cabin like it wanted to rip the walls apart, but inside, it was just the two of them, one man and one broken creature, both held together by nothing but stubborn will. Ethan's hands didn't stop until the wound was fully stitched, the dark thread standing out starkly against the dog's thick fur. He exhaled, pressing one last clean cloth against the stitched skin before finally pulling back. The dog was still watching him. Its amber eyes had lost some of the wild panic from earlier, but there was something else in them now. Exhaustion. And something Ethan recognized all too well. Mistrust. He knew that look. He had seen it in his own reflection too many times. It wasn't just the wound that had broken this dog. Something else had been done to it. Something worse. Ethan sat back, running a hand over his face. He should have left it out there. He should have let the storm take it. But instead, he had brought it inside, stitched it up, kept it alive. And now? Now it was another reminder of everything he had been trying to forget. Ethan sat in his worn-out chair by the fire, staring at the dog lying motionless on the thick blanket. The room was silent except for the crackling of the flames and the howling wind outside, but the tension in the air was heavy, suffocating. He had stitched up the wound, stopped the bleeding, but that didn't mean the dog would make it through the night. It was too still, too weak, too quiet. Bailey sat a few feet away, his dark eyes locked onto the injured animal. His thick, golden fur shone in the firelight, but there was no hostility in his posture, no signs of territorial aggression. Just quiet observation. Ethan trusted Bailey more than he trusted most people. Years of solitude had made the dog his only companion, the only living thing that hadn't betrayed or disappointed him. But this situation was different. This wasn't a stray looking for food. This wasn't some lost pet that had wandered too far from home. This dog had been sent here. Ethan knew that feeling too well, the sense of something being forced into his life whether he wanted it or not. He hated it. With a heavy sigh, he pushed himself up from the chair, wincing as his stiff muscles protested. He had spent too many years living in the cold, too many nights sleeping in places not meant for comfort. The pain in his body was just another thing he had learned to live with. It didn't matter. He walked to the small kitchen, pulling out a can of meat from the shelf. It wasn't much, but it would do. The metal lid peeled back with a familiar pop, the smell filling the air instantly. Bailey perked up at the sound but didn't move. He was waiting. Watching. Ethan crouched down next to the injured dog, placing the bowl of food on the floor beside it. The dog barely reacted at first, its body too drained to recognize the offering. But after a long, tense moment, its nose twitched. A small, weak movement, but enough to tell Ethan that it was still in there, still fighting. "Eat," he muttered, his voice rough from disuse. The word felt strange, foreign. He wasn't used to talking unless it was to himself or Bailey. The dog didn't move. Its amber eyes flickered open, hazy and unfocused, scanning the room like it didn't believe where it was. Ethan had seen that look before, in wounded men who had been dragged from battlefields, in prisoners who had spent too long in the dark. "You're safe," he said, though the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. Safe was a lie. There was no such thing as safe. A long, slow minute passed before the dog finally moved. Its front legs trembled as it shifted its weight, trying to pull itself forward. The effort was painful to watch. Every movement was agony, every inch gained a battle. But still, it pushed forward, dragging itself toward the food with a determination that Ethan couldn't ignore. The moment its muzzle touched the bowl, something changed. The hesitation faded, replaced by something primal. It devoured the food in sharp, desperate bites, as if convinced it would be taken away at any moment. Ethan recognized that too. He didn't look away as the dog ate. He watched the way its body tensed, the way its muscles coiled, ready to flee at the first sign of danger. This animal had been through something worse than just the storm, worse than the wound. It had learned the hard way that food was never a guarantee, that survival was a constant struggle. Bailey inched closer, his movements slow, calculated. He sniffed the air, his ears twitching, but he didn't growl. He didn't bare his teeth. He just watched. Ethan ran a hand over his face, exhaling sharply. This shouldn't have happened. He had spent years making sure nothing unexpected found its way into his life. He had built this isolation for a reason. And yet, here it was, this half-dead thing bleeding on his floor, forcing its way into his world whether he wanted it or not. The dog finished eating but didn't move away from the bowl. Its breathing was still shallow, its body still tense. It didn't trust him. But Ethan didn't want its trust. Bailey, however, seemed to have other ideas. He took another cautious step forward, closing the distance between them. The injured dog stiffened, its ears twitching, its muscles locking up as if expecting an attack. But Bailey didn't do anything. He just sat down, his gaze steady, unreadable. Something passed between them, something quiet, unspoken. Ethan watched as the dog finally let out a slow, defeated breath and dropped its head onto the blanket. Not asleep, not relaxed, but no longer ready to fight. For the first time since finding it at his door, Ethan let himself believe that it might actually survive. The storm outside raged on, the wind screaming against the cabin walls. But inside, in the dim light of the fire, there was something else. A quiet truce. An uneasy bond. And a feeling Ethan couldn't shake, one that twisted in his gut like a warning. This dog hadn't come here by accident. For days, the dog lay near the fire, barely moving. Ethan wasn't sure if it would survive, but he did what he could, fed it, cleaned the wound, and let Bailey get used to its presence. The cabin, normally silent except for the wind outside and the occasional creak of wood settling, now had the weight of another presence. The dog never let its guard down completely. Even in sleep, its breathing was shallow, its muscles tense, as if it expected something to rip it from its fragile rest. Ethan knew that feeling too well. But slowly things changed. The dog ate with less desperation, drank water without needing encouragement. It didn't flinch as much when Ethan moved. The fever that had burned through its body had broken, and the deep wound along its side was beginning to close. Ethan never spoke to it beyond the occasional muttered command. He never gave it a name. He had a rule about things that showed up in his life. Don't get attached because nothing ever stays. Then, without warning, the dog stood. Ethan had been sitting at the table, sharpening his knife, when he heard the soft shuffle of movement. He looked up just as the dog pulled itself to its feet, its legs trembling but holding. Bailey, curled up by the fire, lifted his head in mild interest but didn't move. The dog walked to the door. It didn't limp, didn't hesitate. It just stopped in front of the thick wooden door and stood there, silent, waiting. Ethan set the knife down. There was something deliberate in the way the dog held itself, in the way its ears twitched like it was listening to something Ethan couldn't hear. Its gaze was fixed forward, unwavering. Ethan exhaled sharply. "You want out?" The dog didn't react, didn't turn its head, didn't acknowledge his voice. It just stood there, a statue made of fur and scar tissue. Bailey let out a low breath, shifting his weight but still making no move to interfere. Ethan pushed back from the table and walked over, boots heavy against the wooden floor. He wasn't sure why he was entertaining this, why he was letting himself get pulled into whatever this was. He should have ignored it, should have let the dog figure things out on its own. But something about the way it stood there, waiting, not asking, not begging, just waiting, made it impossible to turn away. With a grunt, he reached past the dog and unlatched the door. The cold hit immediately. The wind had died down since the storm, but the air was still sharp enough to burn. Snow covered everything in thick, untouched layers, the landscape stretching out in a vast expanse of white under the dim, overcast sky. The dog stepped forward. Ethan followed. Bailey, after a moment of hesitation, trailed behind them. The dog moved with a quiet determination, its paws pressing into the snow without hesitation, as if it had been waiting for this moment. Its pace was steady, neither rushed nor slow. It didn't look back to see if Ethan was still there. It didn't need to. Ethan didn't speak, didn't ask questions. He had learned long ago that sometimes it was better to just follow, to let things unfold rather than demand answers. They walked for what felt like hours. The cold gnawed at Ethan's exposed skin, but he ignored it, his breath coming out in short, white puffs. Bailey padded along beside him, his usual calmness unshaken by the strange journey. Then, finally, the dog stopped. Ethan nearly walked past it, but something in the sudden stillness made him pause. The dog stood before a large rock, its surface jagged and uneven, half buried in the frozen ground. At first, it looked like any other boulder scattered throughout the wilderness. But then Ethan saw it. The symbol, carved deep into the stone. A shape he didn't recognize, twisting lines intersecting in a pattern that made his eyes ache the longer he stared at it. It wasn't natural. It wasn't accidental. Someone had put it there. Deliberately. The dog sat down in front of the rock, its gaze locked onto Ethan, its breath slow and even. It had brought him here for a reason. And Ethan had the sinking feeling that he wasn't going to like what came next. Ethan stared at the strange symbol carved into the rock, his breath coming in slow, steady clouds of white against the freezing air. The lines of the carving twisted in unnatural ways, intersecting in a pattern that made his eyes hurt if he focused on it for too long. It wasn't weathered like the rest of the stone. It was fresh, precise, as if someone had made it recently. The dog sat beside him, silent and still, its amber eyes locked onto him, waiting. Bailey lingered a few feet behind, ears perked, his body tense. Ethan had spent years in these woods. He knew every inch of the land around his cabin, knew the way the trees bent under the weight of snow, the way the rivers froze over in the dead of winter. He had never seen this before. He reached out. His fingers hovered over the rock for a moment, hesitating. Something in his gut twisted, warning him to turn back, to walk away. But Ethan had learned long ago to ignore the warnings in his gut. He pressed his hand against the carving. The moment his skin made contact, something slammed into him. Not a physical force, not something he could fight against, but a pulse, an unnatural, crushing weight that surged through his bones, curling around his spine and squeezing the air from his lungs. His vision blurred. His knees buckled and he stumbled forward, barely managing to keep himself upright as his entire body locked up in shock. The cold of the stone was gone. Instead, heat burned beneath his fingertips, not scalding, not painful, just wrong. It spread through his hand, crawling up his arm in slow, steady waves that pulsed in time with his heartbeat. His fingers twitched, but he couldn't pull away. His breath caught in his throat. Memories that weren't his flashed through his mind, images too quick to grasp, faces he didn't recognize, places he had never been. A darkened sky, torn open by something vast and endless. A fire burning in the distance, consuming everything in its path. A silhouette standing at the edge of it all, motionless, watching. Then pain. A deep, gut-wrenching pain that didn't belong to him, but he felt it as if it did. A sharp pressure against his ribs, a tearing sensation down his side, wounds that weren't his own, but mirrored the one the dog had suffered. Ethan wrenched his hand back. The energy snapped away from him in an instant, like a rubber band pulled too tight and suddenly released. He staggered backward, gasping, his legs nearly giving out beneath him. His heart pounded in his chest, his breaths shallow and uneven. The dog didn't move. It just watched. Waiting. Ethan swallowed hard, clenching his fists to stop the tremors in his fingers. He had felt a lot of things in his life. Pain, exhaustion, betrayal. But this was something different. This was something he didn't have a name for. His gaze dropped to the dog. "You led me here," he said, his voice hoarse. The dog didn't respond, but something in its expression shifted. It wasn't just an animal. Ethan knew that now. He didn't know what it was, didn't know what had happened when he touched the symbol, but he knew, deep in his bones, that nothing about this was normal. The wind picked up, howling through the trees, sending a fresh wave of snow swirling around them. Ethan exhaled slowly. Something was coming. And for the first time in years, he wasn't sure if he was ready for it. The storm had settled into an eerie stillness by the time night fell. The wind, which had howled through the trees for days, had quieted into a whisper, leaving only the occasional creak of frozen branches. The weight of what had happened earlier still pressed against Ethan's ribs. He had spent the evening sitting in his chair, staring at his own hand, half expecting to see the strange pulse of energy still crawling beneath his skin. But nothing. Just the steady, calloused fingers of a man who had spent too many years in isolation. Bailey lay curled up near the fire, breathing deeply, oblivious to the unease that lingered in the cabin. The other dog, the one Ethan still refused to name, sat by the door, silent as ever. Watching. Waiting. Then came the knock. A slow, deliberate sound. Ethan's head snapped toward the door. His grip instinctively tightened on the knife resting on the table beside him. No one should be out here. No one should be knocking. Bailey lifted his head but didn't growl. The other dog, however, was already on its feet, its amber eyes locked on the door with an intensity that sent a fresh wave of unease down Ethan's spine. He rose slowly, every muscle in his body tensed, and moved toward the door. The wooden boards creaked under his weight, the sound louder than it should have been in the dead silence of the night. He reached for the handle, hesitated for a fraction of a second, then pulled it open. Nothing. No one. The cold rushed in immediately, cutting through the warmth of the cabin, stealing the breath from his lungs. The snow outside was untouched, except for the footprints. Massive. Leading away from the cabin and into the darkened trees. Ethan's stomach clenched. These weren't human footprints. The dog stepped forward, standing in the open doorway, its body rigid with purpose. Its head turned toward Ethan, eyes gleaming in the dim light of the fire behind them. It wasn't just watching him now. It was waiting for him to follow. Ethan's pulse pounded against his skull. Every instinct screamed at him to shut the door, to lock himself inside, to pretend he hadn't seen anything. But he knew that wouldn't work. He had spent his life running from things that didn't make sense, from things that didn't belong. And yet they always found him. With a slow, measured breath, he stepped into the snow. The cold bit through his boots, the air thick and heavy with the scent of ice and something else, something he couldn't quite name. Bailey whined softly from inside the cabin, but he didn't follow. He was loyal but not reckless. The nameless dog led the way. Ethan followed, his boots crunching against the frozen ground, each step matching the strange footprints that had appeared out of nowhere. The trees loomed on either side of him, their bare branches stretching toward the sky like skeletal fingers. Then he saw it. A figure. Standing in the clearing ahead. The darkness clung to it, making it impossible to see clearly. It wasn't moving, wasn't making a sound. Just standing. Watching. Ethan stopped, his breath clouding in the cold air. His grip tightened on the knife at his side. The figure raised an arm. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't an attack. It was pointing. Ethan followed its gesture, his gaze dropping to the snow-covered ground a few feet away. Another symbol. Glowing. Carved into the ice itself, its light pulsing faintly, casting long, twisting shadows against the trees. Ethan's pulse thundered in his ears. The dog at his side stood motionless, its gaze locked onto him. Waiting. Ethan clenched his jaw, forcing himself to breathe, forcing himself to move. Whatever was happening, whatever had led him here, it wasn't over. It was just beginning. Ethan's breath hung in the frozen air, his heart hammering against his ribs. The figure stood motionless, its form blurred by the darkness, its presence pressing against the night like a shadow that didn't belong. The glowing symbol in the snow pulsed faintly, casting eerie light against the surrounding trees, twisting their outlines into something unnatural. Then, without a sound, the figure vanished. No footsteps. No movement. Just gone. Ethan blinked, his pulse roaring in his ears. His grip on the knife tightened until his knuckles turned white. The cold dug into his skin, sharp and relentless, but he barely felt it. He stood frozen, his mind scrambling to make sense of what he had just seen. Nothing made sense. Nothing about this was real. Except it was. The nameless dog remained at his side, silent and unmoving. It didn't seem surprised. It didn't react with fear or confusion. It simply stood there, Waiting? Ethan turned slowly, exhaling through gritted teeth. The wind picked up, cutting through the trees, but the dog's amber eyes were locked onto him, unwavering. There was something behind that gaze, something that burned with understanding. This wasn't just a lost animal. Ethan had known it the moment he found it bleeding outside his door, but he had refused to accept it. He had spent days convincing himself that it was just another stray, just another wounded thing that had stumbled into his life by accident. But there were no accidents. Not anymore. He took a slow step back, his boots crunching against the frozen ground. The glow of the symbol reflected in the dog's eyes, turning them into twin mirrors of firelight. It had led him here. It had brought him to this place, to this moment. Ethan clenched his jaw. A guide. He hated the word. He hated the idea that something else, something bigger than him, was pulling the strings. He had spent years burying the past, pushing everything away, forcing himself into isolation because he refused to be anyone's pawn. And yet, here he was. The dog didn't move. It didn't force him forward. It simply waited, patient and knowing, as if it already understood what Ethan was struggling to accept. His breath hitched in the cold. This thing, whatever it was far from over. Ethan turned away from the symbol, from the place where the shadowy figure had stood. His boots pressed deep into the snow as he moved, retracing his steps, walking back toward the cabin with the dog beside him. For the first time since it had arrived at his door, Ethan didn't question why it was here. He already knew.